The cinnamon rolls were the first thing Kale found. Not the boy himself, not yet. Just the smell of them, rolling down the corridor like a slow warm tide at 0400. When the station breathed in cycles and no one walked the mess hall passage except ghosts and bakers. Emery Voss, 31 years old, stocky in the way of men who stand at ovens for long hours. Flower in the brown beard he never quite got around to trimming, was pulling the first tray out when the bakery doorway filled with a round-faced shadow. The boy didn't speak. He stood at the threshold with his tiny hands hanging at his sides, golden scales along his knuckles catching oven light like scattered coins, all of them raised and trembling, with some feeling he clearly hadn't learned to name yet. His nose moved. His eyes were steady and very serious. Emery set the tray down, broke off a piece of warm roll, still soft, still steaming, and held it out without a word. The boy took it, and when his little raised scales swept forward and locked briefly around Emery's index finger, warm and firm as a handshake, before releasing all at once, the boy didn't notice. He was already chewing, eyes closed, the most solemn expression Emery had ever seen on a 5-year-old. Emery pulled his hand back, looked at his finger. There was a faint crescent of gold pressed into the skin, shallow, warm, like a ring left by something that had been held a long time. He was still looking at it when he felt the change in the air behind the boy. She was tall, deep amber skin, a single heavy braid over one shoulder, citrine eyes that caught the oven glow and held it. She stood in the corridor just outside the door, and her hands were behind her back. The kind of behind the back that isn't casual, the kind that is work. She shouldn't have been looking at the mark on his finger. She was. If a 5-year-old's golden scales just locked onto a baker's finger over a cinnamon roll, and a queen's breath just caught in a corridor, you might want to subscribe and see where this ends. Velindra entered the bakery on the second day with the energy of someone conducting an inspection. "Kyle!" Her voice was level, measured. "We do not accept food from station workers." She saw the mark, the faint golden crescent on Emery's index finger, already 3 hours old, so already fading at the edges. Her citron eyes went very wide for one precise moment before she gathered herself back in. "Did he clasp you?" Emery looked at his finger. His hand got sticky on my finger for a second." Velindra closed her eyes, a long, slow breath out through her nose. "That is not sticky. That is a juvenile bond clasp. It is temporary in children, but the imprint lasts for days." Emery turned his hand over. The golden mark caught the light. "So your nephew just proposed to me? Over a cinnamon roll?" Velindra did not find this amusing. She collected Kale with one precise hand on his shoulder and walked him out. Emery stood alone in the heat of his bakery with a cinnamon roll going cold on the tray and a queen's name sitting in his chest like a stone he hadn't agreed to carry. He was a station baker. She was a queen. He'd known men like himself his whole life. Good men, quiet men, flower-dusted and early rising. You were the kind of men that royalty walked past in corridors without seeing. He looked at the mark on his finger. Then he started the next batch. Cal came back every morning after that. By day 2, Emery had a system. Food on the counter, not handed over, no contact. Clean, safe. Nobody's hands near anybody else's hands. By day 3, Velindra came with him. She stood in the doorway. Didn't eat, just watched the boy eat, her own hands buried in her sleeves, or her scales invisible and contained and controlled the way everything about her was controlled. Emery learned her tells, the small things, The way her jaw shifted when Kel laughed. The way her gaze tracked the porthole behind him. Stars visible through the round glass. The station turning slowly in the dark. When she thought he wasn't watching. He learned not to watch too obviously. On the fourth morning, Cal reached for a tray on the high shelf, and the stool went out from under him. Oh, Emery moved on instinct, both hands grabbing the boy's small torso mid-fall, and Cal grabbed back, and the scales on both his tiny hands locked around Emery's wrists with a sound like soft snaps. The boy laughed, delighted, dangling. Valindra crossed the bakery in 4 steps, pulling Kyle free, and her bare hands brushed Emery's in the transfer. 1 hand, 3 seconds. Her raised scales extended and clasped, hard and warm and involuntary. 3 of her fingers locked around his. A queen's scales, not a child's. Deeper, permanent. Her eyes went wide in the way of someone watching themselves do something they cannot stop. She ripped her hand free. The scales tore away with a sound like Velcro splitting, and Emery felt it, a bright, quick sting across his knuckles. The golden mark left behind was twice as deep as Kale's had been. Darker, unmistakably hers. A Sithari aide appeared in the doorway, stopped, stared at Emery's hand. Valindra looked at the aide, at Emery, at the mark, the scales along her wrists, visible now, rising and rising. This did not happen, she said. She took Kale and left. The aide followed, already murmuring into a comm device. The bakery held only heat and cinnamon and the quiet tick of the oven settling. And Emery stood at the counter with a queen's bond mark burning softly on his hand, and the absolute certainty that it had in fact happened. The pull between them made no sense. It didn't need to. It was already there, pressed into his skin in gold, humming. The story isn't over. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when she has to come back. 2 days. The golden mark on Emery's hand faded at the edges, but held at the center. A deep amber crescent pressed into the skin above his burn scar. The 2 marks layered now like something written twice in different languages. Bakers in the mess hall noticed. They asked. He said nothing. He sliced bread and measured flour and kept his marked hand below the counter when he could. Morning 3, no Kale. Morning 4, no Kale. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself a lot of things at 0400 when the station was quiet and the oven was the only voice in the room. Then the door opened. Valindra. Alone. No Kale. No aide. No sleeves covering her hands. Her hands were bare for the first time. Bare and visible and trembling in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The golden scales along her wrists and knuckles were raised, every one of them, catching the oven light the way Kel's always did. But Kel was 5 and hadn't learned control yet. She had no excuse. The aide filed a bonding witness report. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. My court has been informed. They're deciding whether to classify it as a diplomatic incident or... She stopped. The scales along her fingers rattled faintly, a dry, delicate sound. So like tiny gold leaves shaking in a wind that wasn't there. I came to tell you I will have it annulled, classified as biological malfunction. You will not be affected. She set her hands flat on the counter. The scales reached toward his burn scar, slowly, visibly straining, the tiny gold edges extending, millimeter by millimeter, toward the closest point of his skin. She stared at her own hands the way a person stares at something that has stopped obeying them. Toda, I cannot stop them. The steadiness in her voice dropped 1 register. Just 1. I had tried for 4 days. They reach for you when I am not thinking, when I am sleeping. A pause that cost her something. They have never done this, not even for my bonded partner. The oven ticked. The cinnamon held the air between them. Emery looked at her hands on the counter, at the scales straining toward his scar, toward the old burn, on the stupid grab-a-hot-tray, bare-handed scar he'd had for 3 years and never thought twice about. He looked at it now. He thought about it now. She had stopped correcting herself. He could see it. The moment she'd walked in without her sleeves, without Kyle, without anything to stand behind. A queen in a flower-dusted room with her hands on a counter and nothing left to hide behind. He didn't reach for her. He didn't pull away. When he set a warm cinnamon roll on the counter between them, exactly the way he'd set one out for Kyle that first morning, pushed to the edge, no hands involved, just an offering sitting in the space between two people. His hand stayed on the counter, open, burn scar up, shaking. I don't know what a clasp means to your people. His voice was quiet and not steady, and he didn't try to make it otherwise. But where I come from, if someone's hands are shaking, you don't annul that. You just... He didn't finish. He left his hand there. The scales moved, 1 centimeter, 2. Slow this time. Nothing like the frantic, involuntary lock from before. Deliberate, each small gold edge extending with the careful intention of something that had been waiting 4 days to be allowed. They reached his burn scar and settled. The warmth was immediate, deep and even, like holding a hand that had always known the shape of his. Her scales flattened smooth against his scarred palm. Not gold gone soft, and the trembling stopped. In her hands first, then in his. The quiet moved through both of them like the oven's heat. Not sudden, just present, the way warmth always was in this room. The old mark and the new clasp merged on his palm, the amber crescent glowing faintly where the two impressions overlapped. One mark now. Hers. The bakery door shifted. Kyle stood in the frame, round-faced, serious, his golden scales raised on his tiny hands the way they always were, because he hadn't learned to bring them down yet, and maybe didn't need to. He looked at their hands on the counter. He crossed the bakery without a word, climbed onto his stool, and placed his small scaled hand on top of theirs. 3 hands, 2 sets of gold, 1 burn scar underneath it all. It wasn't a choice. It had never been a choice. It was something that had started the moment a boy followed the smell of cinnamon down a dark corridor and a baker held out a piece of warm bread without thinking twice, and a queen standing in the shadows had not been able to look away. The oven ticked as it cooled. The porthole behind them held 1 star bright enough to bake by. The cinnamon roll sat untouched on the counter between them, going gently cold. And on the flour-dusted counter of a station bakery, when a queen's hands finally went still, she came to annul a bond her body had already decided. Her hands had other ideas, and now we're all feeling it. If this one stayed with you, subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story is already waiting.